The establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923 was fundamentally driven by a commitment to creating a modern, unified nation-state, a vision that hinged heavily on linguistic and cultural homogeneity. While the preceding Ottoman Empire had tolerated various educational settings, including religious madrasas and specific language instruction in marginalized areas, the new republic sought immediate and absolute centralization. This foundational belief held that national unity could only be forged through a singular, standardized language of instruction, Turkish. This ideological framework set the stage for a systematic dismantling of any existing or potential institutional spaces dedicated to Kurdish education, long before formal bans were codified, making the ultimate removal of these schools an inevitable outcome of the Republican project. The crucial legal turning point arrived on March 3, 1924, with the enactment of the Law of Tevhid-i-Tedrisat, or the Unification of Education. Although primarily designed to secularize and nationalize religious schools, removing them from the control of the caliphate, its sweeping mandate had an immediate and destructive effect on any non-Turkish educational endeavors. By declaring that all educational institutions, from primary schools to universities, must be placed under the direct control of the Ministry of National Education, the law effectively standardized the curriculum. Since the ministry's constitution defined the national language as Turkish, any existing or informal Kurdish schools, often rudimentary and located in rural areas, were immediately deemed illegal or absorbed and converted into Turkish-only institutions. This single piece of legislation eliminated the legal framework necessary for linguistic diversity in education. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, the Republic implemented these laws with increasing rigor, particularly following major Kurdish uprisings like the Sheikh Said Rebellion in 1925. The government's response moved beyond centralization to active suppression, viewing Kurdish educational environments not merely as linguistically diverse, but as potential centers of separatist political activity. Informal madrasas, which traditionally provided some basic literacy in Kurdish or related religious texts, were systematically shut down. Furthermore, the establishment of village institutes later aimed to train teachers strictly loyal to the Republic and its monolingual vision, ensuring that even in the most remote eastern provinces, the messenger of education would exclusively carry the Turkish language and national narrative, erasing local instruction methods entirely. By the mid-1930s, the state's language policy hardened into an explicit doctrine of monolingualism. The Turkish Language Association played a crucial role, promoting the purity and centrality of Turkish. This ideological drive meant that the presence of Kurdish, either spoken or written, in any public sphere, and especially within educational walls, was actively discouraged and often penalized. This wasn't merely about curriculum, it was about defining citizenship itself. Students caught speaking Kurdish in schools faced corporal punishment or public shaming, an institutionalized tactic designed to pressure families into abandoning their mother tongue entirely for their children's success and safety. The goal shifted from absorption to comprehensive assimilation, making educational institutions the primary enforcement mechanisms for this linguistic conversion. The impact on the eastern and southeastern provinces of Turkey was devastatingly acute. In regions where Kurdish was the dominant language, children entering school faced an immediate and complete linguistic barrier. The lack of culturally or linguistically sensitive instruction meant dramatically higher dropout rates and profound educational disadvantages for Kurdish speakers. Educational opportunity became intrinsically linked to the abandonment of the mother tongue. While official records might simply report school closures, these actions represented the eradication of the last vestiges of indigenous educational autonomy. The schools that remained were often viewed by local populations not as centers of learning, but as instruments of governmental control and assimilation, widening the trust gap between the state and its Kurdish citizens. The 1940s and 1950s solidified the assimilation policies, transforming them into bureaucratic routine. This was a period of silence and institutional normalization. The focus shifted from explicit suppression measures to highly controlled mechanisms, standardized textbooks, rigorously vetted teachers, and centralized inspections. Textbooks minimized or erased Kurdish history and culture entirely, framing the region's people as Mountain Turks, whose language was merely a rough dialect of Turkish. This institutionalized erasure ensured that even if a local teacher privately held sympathies, the entire apparatus of the educational system, from funding to career progression, mandated adherence to the monolingual state ideology. Education, therefore, ceased to be a venue for cultural maintenance and became solely a mechanism for enforced national conformity. Following the 1960 military coup, brief flashes of political and cultural liberalization sometimes appeared, but these were always short-lived and swiftly crushed. Intellectuals and activists, emboldened by the slightly more open environment, began making tentative demands for linguistic rights, including education. However, the subsequent constitutions, particularly the one drafted after the 1961 coup, reaffirmed the foundational principle that Turkish was the official state language. This constitutional confirmation served as an absolute legal barrier against any official recognition or funding for Kurdish language instruction. Any attempt to open private schools or cultural associations dedicated to promoting Kurdish language literacy was met with immediate closure, raids, and arrests, demonstrating the state's unwavering commitment to linguistic homogeneity. The long-term consequence of removing Kurdish language education was the creation of a significant cultural vacuum and a multi-generational knowledge gap. While oral tradition remained strong within families, the essential tools for formalized cultural preservation, reading, writing, and structured literary education were lost or severely limited for decades. This resulted in lower formal literacy rates in the mother tongue and accelerated the language shift towards Turkish, particularly among younger generations seeking socioeconomic mobility. Furthermore, the exclusion bred deep resentment. By denying Kurdish citizens the ability to learn in their language, the state effectively communicated that their heritage was illegitimate, contributing directly to the rise of political dissent rooted in identity concerns. The internal migration patterns of the 1960s and 1970s further complicated and solidified the marginalization of Kurdish language education. As large numbers of Kurds moved from rural eastern areas to major urban centers like Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir in search of work, the pragmatic necessity of Turkish fluency became paramount for survival. Children in urban settings, surrounded by Turkish media and exclusively Turkish-speaking schools, rapidly adopted the dominant language. While this integration facilitated economic life, it severely eroded the functional use of Kurdish outside the home. The educational system capitalized on this demographic shift, using it as implicit evidence that Kurdish was a language destined to fade, thus justifying the maintenance of the monolingual policy in the national curriculum. The political awakening of the 1970s brought renewed focus to linguistic rights. As leftist and ethnic movements gained traction globally, Kurdish activists inside Turkey began to explicitly demand the right to education in their mother tongue, challenging the founding tenets of the republic. Groups published clandestine magazines and attempted to establish informal educational circles to teach Kurdish grammar and literature. These efforts were highly localized and dangerous, interpreted by the state as immediate threats to national security and territorial integrity. The demands were consistently and violently rejected, leading to widespread arrests of educators and activists. This confirmed that the ban on Kurdish education was not merely an administrative policy, but a core security doctrine enforced by the state apparatus. The 1980 military coup marked the apex of linguistic repression and the final nail in the coffin for any hope of Kurdish education during that era. The military regime enforced a state of emergency that codified the ban on speaking, publishing, or teaching Kurdish in the harshest possible terms. Even private use of the language was viewed suspiciously. The new regime viewed linguistic diversity as the root cause of instability and separatist terrorism. Schools became more rigid instruments of ideological indoctrination than ever before, focusing heavily on mandatory military and nationalistic instruction. This period institutionalized a deep-seated fear of linguistic identity that would persist for decades, ensuring that the educational system remained a closed monolingual environment until significant legal reforms began to emerge only much later in the early 21st century. The period between 1924 and the 1980s represents a defining chapter in the history of education and identity in Turkey. The systematic removal of Kurdish language schools, driven by the imperative of building a monolingual nation-state, created a legacy of cultural disenfranchisement and educational disparity that continues to influence modern policy debates regarding linguistic rights and minority education. While the state's policies have softened significantly since the 1990s, allowing limited private instruction and elective courses, the fundamental challenge remains: how to reconcile the historical emphasis on national unity with the contemporary need for genuine linguistic pluralism within the public education system. Understanding this historical removal is essential to grasping current demands for mother tongue education today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates and analysis on historical and geopolitical topics.